This week, we're discussing the decisive moment, from Lake Superior to the Sardine Run with Ian Plant. You're listening to the Lakescape Photography Podcast. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Lakescape Photography Podcast. I'm your host, Nicholas Albert, and today we are joined by photographer, educator, and author Ian Plant. In the last episode, we talked about owning your vision, having the courage to show your reality. Today, we're building the bridge back into the field because before an image becomes an edit, it's a decision. And that's what this episode is about, the decisive moment, that split second where the landscape gives you something real. Light, conditions, a fleeting moment, and you either recognize it or you miss it. Ian has chased these moments everywhere, from the cold shorelines of Lake Superior to the absolute chaos of the Sardine Run, where the ocean turns into emotion, energy, and opportunity. They're different worlds, but the same skill applies. Seeing what matters fast, committing to it, and making the photo count. So today, we're talking about how to cut through the noise, stop collecting photos, and start creating photographs with intention by reading the scene, anticipating the story, and making choices that hold up long after the moment is gone. All of Ian's links are included in the show notes below. Check them out as you enjoy this conversation with Ian Plant.
Hey, Nick, great to be here. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm Ian Plant. I have been a full-time landscape and wildlife photographer for the past 20 years now. Wow, I'm getting old. And I'm actually based right now in Minneapolis, been living here for the past 10 years. So, the Great Lakes have been my stomping ground for quite some time. Really love going up to photograph Lake Superior in particular. And I travel the world looking for the most amazing places and subjects to capture with my camera. And you can learn more about my work, see more of my work on my personal website, ianplant.com, or my personal photo education platform, which is called photomasters.com.
Very cool. I actually just bought one of your ebooks probably about a month and a half ago. I want to say it popped up for me and I was like, hey, that looks cool. And I have followed your work for quite some time. So I'm always trying to digest different perspectives and different experiences. And you certainly have a wide range of experiences. Like you mentioned, you're currently residing in the Great Lakes, but you've traveled all over the world. You've been all over the place. Out of all the places that you've traveled to, do you have a favorite?
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and people are usually surprised to learn that my favorite shooting locations are closer to my local area. I've definitely been to some amazing locations and seen some amazing things. And don't get me wrong, I love going and traveling and discovering new things and, photographing epic landscapes or epic wildlife. But some of my favorite photography is close to home. As I said, I love going up to the south shore of Lake Superior. It's just one of the most beautiful places on earth as far as I'm concerned. And probably my favorite landscape location to photograph in the world is Badlands National Park in South Dakota. I go out there every summer during the summer storm season, and I love the landscape. It's interesting because it's kind of a flyover landscape or a drive over landscape. A lot of people who go to the Badlands are going somewhere else. So they stop along their way as they're traveling out west, for example, to go photograph the big national parks like Grand Teton or Yellowstone or some of the others. And so usually people stop at the Badlands. They kind of drive through the main park drive, and stop a few overlooks and say to themselves, oh, it's kind of cool here, but really not worth my time. And then they take off and go somewhere else. But I love getting into the landscape, getting into the Badlands. So getting off the road, getting away from the overlooks, hiking in the actual formations. And then that's when you discover the true unique beauty of the place. It's just this twisted, colored, textured landscape. There's a rainbow of colors in this soft claystone that's been eroding over the past hundreds of thousands of years. And so there's a lot of color and shapes and texture in the landscape itself. And then during the summer in particular, when you've got the summer monsoon, the storm season in the Great Plains, you get these epic, amazing sunset and sunrise skies. And so you just combine that with the landscape, and it's just, it's a fantastic shooting experience. Every time I go, I find something new and different, and I just absolutely love the place.
It's a beautiful area. And it's before we were recording here, Ian and I were actually talking about how it's on my short list for 2026. I really think that 2026 is going to be the year that I finally make the trip. The only thing that's held me back, full disclosure, I don't like snakes. And I've heard that there's some big rattlesnakes out there. So it's kind of, one of those, I want to see it, but I also don't want to have a negative encounter with the wildlife.
Yeah, and there are in fact some pretty big prairie rattlesnakes out there. Like the first 6 or 7 years I was going there, I never saw a single snake. And then one year was the year of the snake. I encountered snakes like half a dozen times, and some of them were really close encounters. And there's something terrifying about a rattlesnake, and something primally terrifying. The rattle is scary enough, but the sound that you really don't want to hear is when the snake is hissing at you. That hiss from the rattlesnake, first of all, that means you're probably pretty close, because it uses the rattle to kind of warn you off. If you're close enough to hear it hissing, then it's really angry with you. But that hissing sound sends a shiver up and down your spine. It triggers like that part of your brain from way back when, the lizard brain. And you just get goosebumps right away. It's this primal fear. And so I always wear snake gaiters when I'm out in the Badlands during the warmer parts of the year, when the snakes are active. I'm not convinced that they're actually going to protect me from a snake bite. Like, it's not like when you go and buy these things on Amazon, you can watch a video of like a person wearing the snake gaiters and someone, walking through a field of snakes, and all the snakes are trying to bite them, but they can't get through it because the snake gaiters work great. You just kind of have to trust that they're actually going to work. So
it's putting your faith in the equipment and hoping that that all ends well and that you don't actually need it while you're there.
Yeah, because like there's really no way to test snake gaiters unless someone actually puts them on and walks through a field of snakes. So
count me out. I'm not interested in being the tester for that.
That said, I very rarely encounter snakes in the Badlands. So it's definitely worth it despite the very small risk of a snake bite. Chances are you're more likely to get hit by a car driving to or from the Badlands than you are to get attacked by a snake.
I haven't gone, like I mentioned. I do spend a lot of time around the Great Lakes, specifically Lake Superior. But then, I've also discussed with people, like, oh, aren't you afraid of bears, wolves, moose? Not really. They'll usually run from you. I've seen bears. I've seen moose. I mean, the only thing that would be intimidating, I've never seen a bull moose, but I've seen a female moose. And I was at a safe distance, so it wasn't really anything too concerning. But still, I mean, you do get an appreciation for how large these animals are. But I feel like, around Lake Superior, it's I wouldn't say it's less dangerous. It's dangerous in its own ways, but it's a little bit more, you can see it coming. You're not worried about there being a giant 5-foot rattlesnake in the brush or anything like that.
Yeah, hiding. It's waiting in ambush. Though I have to admit, there's nothing more terrifying than a large bull moose. First of all, they're much bigger than you think they are, right? Like, especially when they're right in front of you, you realize how massive these animals are. But second of all, like when a moose starts running, I'm convinced that a moose has got 5 brains, one in its head and then one in each of its legs. Because when a moose starts running in the very beginning, it's like every leg seems to be moving in a different direction. And the moose can't figure out which way it wants to go until all of the legs come to a compromised consensus and it takes off in one direction. And so when the moose starts running, you're wondering, is it coming for me or is it going to run in a different direction?
He's trying to figure out if, what direction he's going. But once he figures it out, just pray it's not your direction.
Exactly. And, like Lake Superior, obviously, the lake itself creates its own dangers. I mean, the lake is probably more dangerous than any of the animals that stalk around it. But once again, like my benchmark for everything is chances are, no matter what you're doing, driving a car is more dangerous and more risky than anything you might possibly be doing. So,
Oh, definitely.
yeah.
Definitely. Without question. It's usually the trip that's well, not the trip, but the travel to and from your destination that's more dangerous than anything you're going to encounter out there. But, you know, you've certainly been, as you mentioned, all over the world. You've interacted with different landscapes, different animals, different everything. And you just recently came back from Baja where you were doing some underwater photography. Tell us some of your highlights about that.
Yeah. Okay. So this was an amazing trip. I was down in Mexico off the coast of Baja, California. I was there to photograph what's known as the Sardine Run. So I don't know why they call it a run, but this because they're swimming. But I think Sardine Run sounds a little bit more dramatic. But you get these massive schools of sardine and mackerel and some other bait fish that are migrating, and they school in these large groups. I think that the theory is that from their perspective, that if they're in a big group, there's less of a chance that any one individual predator will pick them off versus the 10,000 other fish they're with. Maybe a little bit of convoy theory as well. I don't know. I'm not really, up on the biology here. And so what happens is when the predators find these convoys of fish, these schools of bait fish, they start chasing. And what happens is that the fish in the school, when they're being chased, they form into this very compact ball. And so the fishermen call them bait balls. And so you've got these bait balls of sardine and mackerel that are being pursued by these massive underwater predators. And so more often than not, it's sea lions and it's marlins. Though sometimes you'll get some other, larger predators like whales or dolphins or, maybe even sharks occasionally going after these bait balls. And so the predators are just basically chasing the bait balls until the fish, the sardine or the mackerel, get really, really tired and start to slow down. And then eventually they just stay in one place. And then it's like an all-you-can-eat buffet for the predators. They just go in, a marlin will swim through the bait ball, or a sea lion will do the same thing and grab a fish or two on their way through. And so eventually you could see the bait ball going from several thousand fish to several hundred to several dozens to just a handful of fish that are remaining. And then the remaining fish might scatter at the end of this. And so it's an amazing event because you might be witnessing, anywhere from 5 to 10 or 20 sea lions, or 10 to 20 to 40 or 50 marlin that are just sort of circling around this bait ball. And then the individual animals will go in and try to get some fish. And so it's amazing to watch this. And I've done a lot of wildlife photography. And when you're on the land, you are usually somewhat removed from the action. Like, if you're in Africa, for example, you're in a safari vehicle. And so you can witness everything, but you're kind of safely ensconced within the vehicle. So you're a little bit removed from the action. When you're doing underwater photography, you're in there, in the middle of all of it. And you've got these predators swimming around you. So you are literally immersed in the action. And so that's a lot different. It's a lot more thrilling of an experience. Like at some points, the marlin or the sea lions would just come swimming right by me, and they're not really interested in me. They might be curious about what I'm doing, but they don't view me as prey, which is great. And luckily, they don't view me as a larger predator. They just, I'm just this curiosity. But sometimes they're going right by you. And so I kid you not, at one point, I was actually smacked by a marlin.
What?
The marlin was going by me. It was so close. I'm not sure if it hit me with one of its fins or smacked me with its tail. All I know is I felt this heavy bump. I was kind of in the way between where he was swimming up. He might have been using me as like a stalking horse. I don't know. And so as he went by, I just got a little shove from him. So yeah, it's a much more, as I said, immersive, chaotic experience compared to photographing wildlife on the land.
Yeah, I mean, as you were describing it, I was just sitting there thinking it's probably, at least from my perspective, it sounds like it's probably the most intense wildlife photography endeavor you could really put yourself in the center of safely. and still have a really cool experience.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it kind of feels that way. Certainly I've witnessed some pretty intense wildlife experiences. Like if you're photographing the wildebeest migration in Kenya or Tanzania, there might be tens of thousands of animals, millions of animals around you. And it can be pretty crazy. You're watching a hunt where some lions come in and take down a wildebeest or something like that. But, as I said before, you're not really right in the middle of it. And so the Sardine Run is just so unique because you are in the middle of it. It's this big high density event. There's literally hundreds or thousands of critters in front of you, like between the bait ball fish themselves and then the predators around them, and you're just kind of in the middle of it. And when I say you're in the middle of it, sometimes you're literally in the middle of it. So the sardine, especially when they're tired, and they know that the end is coming for them, they're basically looking for some shelter. And so typically they would see a person in the water and they'd be afraid of that person. They think, oh, that's a predator, stay away. But when the predators are all around them and closing in, their natural fear of us is overridden. And so they come and they'll try to use you as shelter. And so sometimes what happens is the bait ball will start swirling around you. And, you do your best to avoid that. But it's kind of inevitable when the sardine bait ball gets small enough. And if you're close enough that you can see them, they can see you, and they will come over and swirl around you. And so you're literally in the middle of this swirling bait ball. And at that point, you got the bigger predators. They're circling around. They see you in there. They don't want to attack because they're a little bit nervous about you, but they might be just swimming around you, looking if there's a way that they can come swooping in without getting too close to catch a fish. And so you're like literally in the middle of this crazy action. It's something definitely I try to avoid at all costs, but it happens from time to time. There's not much you can do about it.
Yeah, my first thought was, you mentioned that larger predators will go darting through there. I wouldn't want to be in the middle of that if a sea lion or a whale, dolphin, what have you, came barreling through there at full speed. That sounds extremely dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially with the marlin, because each marlin has got a sword attached to its mouth. And they actually can spear things with. I've seen them spear fish with their beak, whatever you want to call it. So it's something that's a real weapon. It's dangerous. It's something you definitely don't want to have pointed in your direction. I'm not sure whether a bony human body would withstand the attack force better than a soft cartilage body that a fish has, but I really don't want to find out. So
yeah, I don't want to be on that the testing end of that theory.
Maybe if I wear my snake gaiters,
yeah,
I'll be protected.
Yeah, bring the gaiters with. I mean, hey, at that point, anything helps, right?
I feel like I'm giving people the impression that I'm constantly subjecting myself to grave danger when I'm doing my photography. I would say that 99.9% of the time, there is no grave danger.
It's just part of the adventure. It's what makes it unique and special. And, especially, when we're out there, of course, there's inherent risks that come with it and, naturally come with the territory. But most of them, to Ian's point, we're not out here, trying to be a hero and doing anything crazy. It's just another day in the life, really.
Yeah, yeah. And, honestly, sometimes I feel like it's riskier walking along rocky, like wet rocks on the shore of Lake Superior, or if you're up on a cliff on the edge of the lake. I remember once kayaking below pictured rocks, and there was some rock fall very close to me. Rocks, the part of the cliff came down, and when you got these giant rocks falling just 5 feet away from your kayak, you realize, well, this is probably more dangerous than most of everything else that I do. And so, yeah, there's always a little bit of inherent risk with everything that we do once you're out in the outdoors. But, most of the time that risk is manageable. And most of the time, as I pointed out, it's a smaller risk than you take on in your daily life every time you jump in a car.
Right. Yeah, of course. Exactly. When you're out there and or I guess when you were out there in Baja California, were you strictly doing wildlife, or were you combining the landscape with some underwater scenes, doing like split shots where maybe you can see partially underwater, partially above?
Well, the Sardine Run occurs far off the coast, so you're in open water, and so the landscape, you can see it in the distance, but it's just too far away. Even with an over/under shot, it really wouldn't show up with a wide angle lens. And so I was just kind of focused on the underwater wildlife photography while I was there. But Baja has got beautiful landscapes as well. There's this epic desert, you got beautiful coastline. And so even though I've been focused on the underwater adventure, my last two trips there, I'm hoping to go back soon and explore more of what the land has to offer.
Very cool. Now, have you ever done anything like that here in the Great Lakes as well, where maybe not the wildlife side, but underwater photography in Lake Superior or any of the Great Lakes?
No, but I'm definitely thinking about it now that I've taken it up. And so I'd love to go up and figure out if there's any good opportunities around Lake Superior for some underwater photography. I doubt very much that there's going to be a lot of really good opportunities for underwater wildlife photography. There are fish, obviously, in the lake, but because it's so cold, it doesn't have anywhere near the abundance of life that you get in warmer waters or certainly in salt water. And so I'm not sure what kind of opportunities I might have with that, but I'm thinking of some underwater landscape type photography, like Pictured Rocks or the Apostle Islands. There might be some really cool formations that you can see underwater. So I'm eager to get my underwater housing and my camera up there this summer. I'll wait till the lake warms up a bit. So maybe towards the end of summer.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and as you mentioned, like the Apostle Islands, Pictured Rocks, I've seen some underwater scenes from both of those locations. Usually it's people shooting from like a kayak or um, something to that degree, and beautiful, incredible landscapes. It just the geology is just incredible when you really start getting into the water, or when you change the perspective from a kayak to getting in and actually seeing what's below the surface. When you're going out and, for example, this Baja California adventure that you had gone on, what are some of your safety procedures where, what are you thinking as you're looking at a trip going into the water? What should people be aware of? As a photographer, what are you thinking?
Well, I mean, definitely one of the aspects of safety that you've got to think about is interacting with the wildlife. So knowing a little bit about how the wildlife would interact with a person, what sort of behaviors they have, so you can tell if they're, sizing you up as a potential morsel or if they're threatened by you or anything like that. So, learning a little bit about their behaviors, that's always part of making sure that you're safe when you're doing that type of photography. I think just floating around in the water is probably the most dangerous part of it. And so I was doing all snorkeling, so not scuba. So that obviously makes things a little bit easier, maybe arguably a little bit safer. So staying, near the surface of the water, I think is probably a little bit less complicated than going down under. But obviously have to be capable of swimming, and not sinking below the water, keeping your head above water. Yeah, so yeah, I think drowning is probably the most significant risk, and that can happen from a number of things. Like if the water's cold and you don't have the proper insulation, so making sure you've got an adequate wetsuit to keep you warm when you're in the water, because hypothermia could definitely be a risk, and that could cause all sorts of problems. And it like being careful, being aware of what's going on when you're jumping out of the boat. And so part of what makes the Sardine Run so thrilling is that you're out on this boat in the open ocean, and the captains are trying to find these bait balls. They're basically chasing these bait balls around, and they can see where the bait balls are because as you're going along the water, you might see a large collection of birds. And so if the birds are collecting in the open water, then that means that there's something there that they're hunting. And so that's how the captains can spot the bait balls from miles and miles away. And then once they get up to them, they're trying to find bait balls that you can jump in on. And so preferably they're going to find one that's static, that's not really moving, one of those tired bait balls I was mentioning earlier. But a lot of times the bait balls are still on the run. And so the best the captain can do is get the boat right in front of its path so you can jump in right away and then photograph the action as it's going by, maybe swim after it a little bit, but you'll tire out. And so I found that to be probably the part that was the most dangerous, was jumping out of the boat. The boat's still moving because the captain's trying to do his best to get the boat in the proper position. But basically, as he's going by, he might just be like, go now. And everyone jumps in. And so you got to avoid getting hit by the boat. You got to avoid getting hit by anyone else who's going in the water with you. So I always found that to be the most chaotic, the most disorienting, and the most dangerous part of it. So just being very careful and aware of the physics of the movement when you're jumping in the water. That's something that I would always pay very close attention to as well. And of course, if you're doing anything that takes you deeper underwater, then the complications and the risks magnify. So there's a lot of things to be aware of and to be thinking about. But I think, as I said, basically the water temperature and just being in the water are probably the most dangerous things. And so making sure you've got the proper insulation and making sure you've got enough physical stamina to keep up with what you're doing. That's really critical as well, because, the boat's there. So if you have a problem, chances are the boat can get to you in time. But if something unexpected happens, let's say you get smacked by a marlin and it knocks you unconscious, that obviously could be a potentially risky thing.
Very. You don't want to be unconscious underwater. That sounds like a terrible combination of events.
Exactly. So, it's just making sure that you're prepared to minimize the risk of anything like that happening.
That certainly builds into going with trained individuals and people that are familiar, and I'm sure good captains and everything. Everybody's got their part to play. And as you were describing that, I was thinking to myself, not only are you jumping into this body of water, whether it be one of the Great Lakes or the ocean or wherever you might be in the world, but you also have all your camera gear with you too. So you've got this added weight. You've got these cameras that you obviously don't just want flying around as you're jumping in. When you're doing this, are you just bringing a single body and lens combination with you, or are you bringing two different bodies, two different focal lengths in their water housings? How are you approaching that?
Well, so I have one housing. And so typically what I do on a trip like this is I'll bring one body plus a backup in case something happens, and then maybe one or two lenses. And so I'll pick the focal length that I think will work best and use that. But I've got another focal length with me. If it turns out that one's not working, I can always open up the housing and switch lenses. But when I'm in the water, it's one housing, one camera, one lens. And so you kind of are stuck with whatever you pick. If you've got a zoom lens, that gives you some flexibility. If you're working with fixed focal lengths, then it's, you're really stuck with what you have. But the housings are sufficiently big and bulky that it's really, it's not impossible to bring two housings. It just makes travel much more complicated. So what I do is I actually have a, big bulky housing for my camera, but then I've also got a backup. So if something happens to the housing, let's say that marlin smacks my housing, busts it up, and I can't use it anymore. I have a small housing that's designed to fit over my iPhone. And so I can use that as a backup. So even if something happens to my main system, it's not going to be quite as good. It's not going to be as flexible or as versatile as my digital camera with the housing. But at least it keeps me going if something catastrophic happens.
Yeah, of course. I mean, backup gear is essential. And, I've always thought that too on every trip. If my main camera failed, my backup camera failed, what would I do? And I've always thought, well, I still have my iPhone. It's not my preferred choice, obviously. I mean, it's not what I'm out there trying to use, but if I have nothing else, it's better than nothing.
Yeah, and it's the new camera phones are actually quite good, and they make a perfectly reasonable backup. So that does simplify travel quite a bit. And that way I typically don't have to bring a backup camera and backup lenses. So I know my iPhone is always ready to go. And I was in the Badlands earlier in the year, leading some workshops, and I had a problem with my battery charger. So I couldn't recharge my batteries. So my battery ran out, and I spent several days shooting just with my iPhone. And honestly, I don't think anyone looking at the photos I took with my iPhone compared to my main digital camera, I don't think anyone would notice the difference. The quality is really amazing. You're outputting close to a 50 megapixel file, sometimes even more with these new phones. And honestly, I think I could probably do all of my landscape photography with my phone now if I had to. It's still not great necessarily for the wildlife, but that it's good enough that I could definitely do a lot of photography with it, and no one would ever know the difference.
Yeah, I've seen some comparisons. There was one just recently, I want to say it was a couple months ago, maybe, where somebody took a Sony A7R and I don't remember which phone it was, but they basically took the same picture. It was actually in the Grand Tetons, which is, like we talked about, close to the Badlands in a roundabout way. But they took the same image side by side, and they had this image up on Facebook, this side by side comparison, and didn't say which camera was which. And the caption was just, "Can you guess what took this image?" And realistically, you really couldn't, unless you were really like pixel peeping, you really couldn't tell. The only thing that kind of somewhat gave it away was the way the processing in the phone handled the really bright, brilliant orange hues in the sky. It made them a little bit, I wouldn't say oversaturated, but almost like made them ghost-like in a way. And that was really the only key difference. But to the untrained eye, you'd probably never know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's very true. And if you're shooting raw with your camera phone, then you've got a lot more flexibility to kind of work around that weird processing that the phones sometimes do. And honestly, if I was doing only landscape, I would seriously consider just shooting with my phone for a lot of stuff. It's really quite amazing. And I've been using my phone as a scouting tool. It's really great just walking around looking for compositions, having the phone held out in front of you, so you can actually see in real time how the compositions change as you move around. And so I find that it's an essential tool for me. It's a great teaching tool because I can show my students on my workshops, like, here, if you put your camera right here, look how all the visual elements line up. See what happens with the composition, and they can see it in real time. And so I've been using my phone for years for that. But the truth is, it's gotten so good that I could probably do 90% of my photography with my phone, and I'd be perfectly happy with the results.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I've taken some images on my phone too, where I've looked and I've just thought, that's a perfectly reasonable shot. As far as getting into the water and working with light, I know that there's color shifts underwater. I know that there's all kinds of different challenges, from light to white balance, all these different things. When you're getting into the water, when you're preparing for underwater photography, how are you handling those challenges with reduced light based on your depth, or your white balance freaking out because now everything is blue, basically?
Well, yeah, definitely. You're right. Shooting underwater, light behaves much differently than it does above the water. And so I actually think the color shift underwater is the easiest to handle because automatic white balance on cameras is very good. And so I just leave my white balance on auto when I'm shooting above the water. Same thing when I'm shooting below the water. find that the camera gets the white balance correct or close to it pretty much all the time. Like my recent trip down to Baja, I found that I was maybe dialing in some extra magenta into my images when I was processing my raw files. But that's the great thing about white balance, is that you can make those adjustments when you're processing the images penalty free. There's no gain in noise or any loss of image quality when you change your white balance later on. So, I don't really want to think about it when I'm doing photography. I'd rather let the camera think about it. And then I can always change things later if I think the camera gets it wrong. But usually, camera does a really good job with white balance. But the fact that light it decreases rapidly the more water the light has to travel through. That is the primary challenge. Because when you're photographing something like the Sardine Run, there might be action in front of you near the top of the water, or there might be a bunch of marlin swimming beneath you. And so you might want to shoot the action that's near the surface, and then you might want to point your camera straight down. And it's a lot darker when you're pointing your camera straight down versus pointing your camera towards the water that's closest to the surface where there's more light. And so those wild variations in the light mean that you constantly have to be adjusting your exposure value unless you are shooting in some sort of automatic mode. And so I find when I'm shooting underwater that I typically don't want to play around with my shutter speed or my aperture. So I want to shoot at usually like 1/500th of a second, or maybe even a little bit higher, to make sure I capture the action. Sometimes the action's kind of slow, but then you will have a sea lion or a marlin just dart in really quick and go after the fish. And so you don't really have time to change that variable on the fly. So you always set it for fast action, even if you don't need it most of the time. And same thing with aperture. Like I want some depth of field. So usually I'm shooting at f8 or f11 because there might be fish in front of you in different planes of focus. So there might be a marlin that's 6 feet away from you, and then you've got a sea lion that's 15 feet away from you. So you want to have a little bit of depth of field to capture everything sharp in the image frame. And so those variables are typically set. I'm not playing around with them. And it's very difficult to change your settings underwater. The housing's got all sorts of buttons and knobs, but everything is just much more complicated when you're underwater. Sometimes it's hard to find the right knob to turn to change your shutter speed or your aperture. And you can't always easily see what's going on in the viewfinder or with the live view screen because you've got a mask on. And so it's hard to get your face close enough to see the small little number settings that you're changing. And so those variables are typically pretty fixed. So the only variable that I have that I would be freely adjusting would be ISO. And so what I do when I'm shooting wildlife typically is I shoot with auto ISO most of the time anyways, because a lot of times I'm in changing light situations. And so I don't want to be constantly resetting all my settings when I'm shooting. So I use auto ISO. When I'm on the land, it's easy to adjust my aperture or my shutter speed as necessary. Like if I'm getting ready to, like I see a lion stalking its prey and I know a chase is about to happen, I know I need that fast shutter speed. So I can set that pretty easy when I'm on the land. It's easy to find the buttons and to see what you're doing. But I do keep auto ISO when I'm doing most of my wildlife photography because there are often sudden shifts in the light. And so if you're, getting ready to photograph that chase scene, it's bright sunlight, and then when it happens, suddenly a cloud rolls over the sun. You don't want to be thinking about, oh goodness, the action's happening now. I need to change my ISO because otherwise everything's going to be too dark. And so auto ISO allows the camera to keep track of those variations in the light. And so then the only thing you really need to pay attention to is your overall exposure value. And so you're trying to avoid overexposing your highlights. And so I will use exposure compensation as necessary to make sure I'm not clipping any of my highlights when I'm shooting these action sequences. Or maybe I'll do positive exposure compensation if I'm finding that the camera's underexposing everything and I can give it a little bit extra exposure. And so that's usually, once again, pretty easy to do on the land. But when I'm underwater, I find that that it's really tricky to once again manipulate the dials quickly. And so usually I try to have everything set in a way that's optimized for the harshest shooting or the most demanding shooting circumstance that might occur. So underwater, it could be really fast action that's happening out of nowhere, or it could be shooting in more contrasty light. And so usually I'm using auto ISO underwater, but I might be setting my exposure compensation to like -1 to make sure that even if there are some bright highlights in the water, like if I'm shooting in a situation that's more backlit, that I'm not going to accidentally be overexposing any of those highlights. So the auto ISO is critical, but usually I'm just kind of underexposing the images a little bit just to be on the safe side to make sure I'm not overexposing those critical highlights.
That makes sense. And I really liked how you said in there, no penalization for changing that later. So it saves all of us, I'll say. It saved us all at some point.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the raw file gives you a lot more latitude for editing, so you don't have to get it exactly right. You really just have to worry about some very broad concerns. So one concern is avoiding clipping your highlights, because if your highlights are overexposed, then you can't recover that detail. It just goes pure white. And if you try to drop the exposure, that pure white just goes to gray. There's no detail there. And so you want to avoid that at all costs if you possibly can, with some minor exceptions. Like if you're doing a landscape shot and you're shooting into the sun, for example, getting a sun star, the sun's always going to be overexposed itself. So you can't really avoid clipping that highlight, for example. You just want to make sure you're not clipping any important highlights. It's okay to have that little sunburst effect, be a little overexposed in the middle of the sun. That's no big deal. But the other thing you want to worry about is digital noise, which is hiding in the shadows. And so you don't want to completely underexpose your photos either. You want to give your photos as much exposure as you can without overexposing the highlights. And with a lot of the newer cameras, you've got this thing, I don't want to get into it, but you've got ISO and variance as well. Everyone wants to know about ISO and variance. The key thing that people need to know about ISO and variance is that built into the name itself is that it is invariant. It doesn't matter, but so the idea of that is that you could use a lower ISO. And if you're using that lower ISO and you can't change your aperture and shutter speed settings, the only thing you really can change is your ISO up or down. If you increase your ISO, you get more digital noise. So you keep your exposure value where it needs to be using the higher ISOs, but you get more digital noise. Well, cameras that are ISO invariant, and I said I didn't want to get into this, but here I am getting into it. Cameras that are ISO invariant, technically what that means is that if you use a lower ISO and underexpose your images, when you bring up the exposure value processing later on, you're going to have noise. It's going to be the exact same noise that you would get if you just use the higher ISO to get that proper exposure value. So ISO invariance means it doesn't really matter whether you push your ISO higher or lower. To some extent. As I said, it's very technical. I really don't want to get into it too deep. Some people think that that's like a get out of jail free card, that you can just shoot at like a low ISO and you'll never have noise. That's not true. If you're not getting a proper exposure value, you're going to end up with noise. So, as I said, if you can adjust your other variables, your aperture or your shutter speed, which actually lets in more light or controls how much light is coming in, you could let in more light, have more photons hitting your sensor. So you still want to give that exposure as much as you can so that you got a nice clean image file. Once again, with the caveat that you want to avoid overexposing your highlights. But if the only variable you can adjust to get more exposure is ISO, which is just increasing the sensitivity of the sensor to light, that's going to introduce noise into the final image. Which is fine because it's, modern noise reduction techniques are really good, and digital cameras are really good at handling noise, much better than they were 20 years ago. And so it's not the worst thing in the world to shoot at ISO 3200 or 6400. You can still get a really usable image. Basically, I just went into this much deeper than I wanted to. Basically, the bottom line is when you're shooting raw with modern digital cameras, you've got a lot of leeway to adjust things in the processing phase without losing too much in the way of image quality. So it's really great. It not only allows us to make more mistakes than in the film age, but it also gives us a little bit more creative license. It allows us to get photos that otherwise would have been impossible because the shooting conditions would be too extreme. But now you can get these shots that you couldn't get with film.
Yeah. And having started in film myself, years ago now, I look back at some of my old contact sheets and some of the prints I made, when you first start going through images and okay, I'm just going to make a test print and I'm going to write on it. I'm going to go through and figure out what I want to dodge, what I want to burn, all the other stuff. You look at some of those images, and I've had that same thought where it's just like, wow, think about how far we are from what we could do to what we can do now. And that just huge leap in technology. And you can shoot scenes, you can shoot a single image and have all of the data that you could possibly need. Now, when you're bringing these raw images from an underwater shoot into, Lightroom or Photoshop, what does the typical underwater raw file look like? And what are the first adjustments that you're typically making?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that there's necessarily a standard workflow because it really depends on the image, the shooting circumstances. The way I might process a file that, where I'm shooting into the light versus one where I may be pointing the camera straight down at the action that's going on in the water underneath me. Those are two very different circumstances, and it really depends on what my settings were. As I said, I'm optimizing my settings for the most extreme conditions I might encounter. And so if I'm photographing something less extreme, it might come into, I use Adobe Camera Raw for my processing. And so it might come into Camera Raw looking very underexposed. And so something like that, the first adjustment I'm going to make is to open up the exposure. And then the second adjustment I'm probably going to make is to clean up the digital noise using the new denoise that's available in Lightroom or Camera Raw. And so those are two very critical adjustments that I'm making to a lot of these images. Another adjustment that gets made a lot is straightening the horizon. Of course, underwater, you're not really seeing the horizon. You're just seeing the lower edge of the waves. But so the underwater photography is very much shooting from the hip. I mean that quite literally. A lot of times you've got the camera just kind of down and away from you. So you're pointing the camera towards the action, but you're not trying to get the camera up to your eye because you're snorkeling. So your head's at the top of the water. You want the camera a little bit lower than the top of the water. And so you've got the camera down more in the area of where your waist is under the water. And, you may be pointing it slightly upward at the action. And so you can't actually see what is going on through the viewfinder most of the time. And so a lot of times I find that my horizon's a little bit crooked or maybe a lot crooked with these shots. You think you've got it nice and straight, but you're floating, everything's bobbing up and down. You can't always keep the horizon exactly level. So leveling is another adjustment I make quite a bit. And then there's typically one very common thing is cleanup of the image. You might have a lot of particles floating in the water. This is called backscatter by underwater photographers. And so you want to clean up the backscatter. Luckily, there's some plugins in Photoshop that do it very well, clean it up, but there might be some more advanced cleanup. Sometimes you might have to take out something like, another person who's in the water, another snorkeler who's kind of lurking in the background. You couldn't quite get him out of your shot. So there might be some more cleanup of that sort of thing. And so those are the most common parts of my workflow. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes the white balance is a little bit off. I find that when my Sony camera, it does a pretty good job, but I think that the images come out a little green sometimes. So there's often a shift over to magenta to kind of neutralize that green and to present the water as kind of a more neutral blue as opposed to something that's kind of greenish or purplish. And so I do play around with that a lot. And a lot of times I want to increase the contrast in the water. This is going to help make the subjects stand out a bit more. And the water that's surrounding them will darken. And so usually the way I do that is using the dehaze slider. So I might add a little bit of dehaze. And so the dehaze slider, people think of it as being something to cut through atmospheric haze. And that's kind of what it's designed to do. But what I think when Adobe was designing the dehaze slider, what I think they were really trying to do was to find a way to make blue skies more dramatic, or, partly cloudy skies more dramatic. Because what the dehaze slider does is, when you're using it for, let's say, a landscape image, it will have a global effect unless you're applying it locally with a brush or one of the other masking tools. So if you're just doing it globally, you'll see it impact the entire image. But most of that change is going to be in the sky. Like there's a strong bias towards the sky. And so what you'll see in the sky is you'll see like the blue in the sky go a lot darker when you use the dehaze slider. And that makes anything like clouds, for example, like white puffy clouds, they're going to pop out a lot more. So the dehaze slider is really increasing the contrast, but it's also introducing this bit of a blue shift to the image. And as I said, it's kind of biased towards the sky when you're using it globally for a landscape image. And so for underwater, basically the slider, I think it sees all of the blue water as being the sky. So it has a very similar effect. It darkens those blues and it increases the saturation a bit in those blues as well. And it really increases the contrast between anything that's not blue. So, the marlins and the sea lions and the sardines and the mackerel and whatever, they really pop out, and that background water just goes darker. And so I find it has a really positive impact on the overall contrast and color on the image. So I'm using that dehaze slider quite a bit. Actually, the dehaze slider is one of my favorite sliders. It's kind of my secret weapon when I'm doing landscape photography, when I've got a dramatic sky. Especially like, for example, when I'm photographing the Badlands during the summer, when you've got like an epic thunderstorm brewing at sunset. The dehaze slider really makes that sky look much more dramatic. So to me, it's my dramatic sky slider, and it's my underwater slider.
Yeah, I'm very much so in the same camp where, but you can go the opposite direction with it too, depending on the atmospheric conditions you're shooting in. And like I've noticed, like if you're shooting a foggy scene, if you go a little to the left on the dehaze slider, you can really make that fog pop, and it really brings it to life. But like you said, a really powerful sky or subject or what have you, you want to bring a little bit more contrast, or even just do it locally. Maybe, you're working micro contrast, however your creative vision guides you. That little slider is a powerhouse once you know how to use it.
Yeah, you got to be careful with it because it's kind of like a sledgehammer. And so if you use it like a sledgehammer, it's just going to ruin your images. And so the trick is to figure out a way to use that sledgehammer like one of those precision micro screwdrivers, So like, it has its place. Certainly some images, it's a bad thing. And usually you want to use it very subtly. And, as you mentioned it, so when you use it positively, increases contrast very dramatically. But when you go to negative dehaze, it's reducing contrast. So for a scene like a foggy scene where you don't have much contrast, that can give it more of a glowy, mysterious kind of ethereal look. But once again, if you go too far to the left, it'll just look crazy. It'll destroy everything. So it's a very, very powerful tool that needs to be used subtly, very gently.
Yes. Yeah. That's something that I've always reiterated with people when I'm educating, or when I'm working with someone one-on-one or in a workshop setting. Just because we can take it to 100 or 50 or whatever doesn't mean we have to go all the way. Precision beats going crazy every time. I mean, I'm sure you've experienced the same thing, especially by the sounds of it with the challenges of shooting underwater, and also with your combined knowledge and experience and expertise with landscapes, where sometimes you can bring an image into Adobe Camera Raw, which is actually what I use too. But I've noticed that when you get it right, those sliders, you don't really have to go crazy with them. You can maybe add just a little bit of dehaze, maybe shift your white balance just a little bit, just tighten up a few minor details and do some image cleanup, like you mentioned, and it's a finished piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think, basically what you're getting at there is that it's important to get it right in camera to some extent. We're talking about
Yeah.
how the raw file gives you some leeway, but anyone who shot film, back in the days of film, there was no post processing, didn't exist, especially if you're shooting color slide film. You took a photo, you sent the film to a lab, it was processed according to a standard process, and you got back a slide that was the finished product. And so there was no adjustment afterwards. To me, what making a photograph was what you did before you press the shutter button. There was no after. And with digital, we now have some more creative leeway, so we can make those adjustments later on. And that I appreciate that flexibility. I like that. But shooting film taught me that if you want to be good as a photographer, you really have to learn how to master light. You have to learn how light works, what light is good for photography, what light isn't. You have to learn how light and color interact. And you have to learn how to master visual design, composition. And so if you really embrace figuring these things out, you're going to find that you do very little work in the digital darkroom. And so people are often shocked when they see my digital darkroom workflow because I use some very simple tools. I'm not doing anything fancy. I'm never the kind of person who's going to be like, hey, everyone, let me show you this trick, this hack in, Lightroom or Camera Raw that, no one else knows about. It's all very simple. As a matter of fact, I've had some people on my workshops who think I'm lying. They don't believe me when I'm showing them my workflow for my images. They think I'm holding back. And part of the reason is that a lot of photographers who came up in the digital age only, who've never shot film, don't really take the time to learn how light and composition work. To them, light is something that's created when you're processing the image. And you'll see photographers that will offer tutorials showing you how you can turn a really ho-hum photograph into something amazing in the digital darkroom. And I personally don't teach that. I teach people how to take really good photos. And so when you really learn how to master light, when you really learn how to master composition, you're going to find that your workflow is very simplified. And people are shocked that most of my images are a 30-second or less edit. And it's usually just, moving around a few sliders, maybe making a few local adjustments. When you really know what you're doing in the field, then that really makes the digital darkroom a lot easier. And, so recently I had a photographer email me. He saw a picture I'd taken in the Cypress Bayou of East Texas this past fall. And it was a real foggy day. Like, it was this very thick fog. And so I took some photos in the fog and I shared them. And he emailed me to ask me, like, do you have a tutorial that shows how you did this? And I haven't written them back yet, but I'm going to write them back and say, well, no tutorial is needed. Basically, I waited for a really foggy day, pointed my camera at this scene and took the picture. That was pretty much it. Like the edit in Camera Raw was 10 seconds, I barely did anything because the conditions were perfect. And so I think he thinks that there was some trick to making the scene look foggy. He's probably waiting for me to do a tutorial on using negative dehaze or negative clarity to make, your normal landscapes look like they were taken in the fog or something like that. That's not at all a part of my workflow. So when I'm teaching photography, I emphasize actually learning how to take good photos and not learning all of these tricks in the processing phase that you can use to make your average photos look fantastic. Because I don't know. I just don't think that's what photography is all about.
Like I like to add like the Gaussian blur and the Orton effect, right? So you get that nice soft, the soft highlights and that kind of thing. But one thing that I learned over the years was a lot of it just comes down to getting it right in field, and you're golden. As long as you can do that, you don't need to do that much. Maybe, like I mentioned, put the Orton effect on it, give it that little artistic touch. But as long as it's right in camera, on location, there's really no tricks.
Yeah, and I think that's true. And, I certainly embrace the flexibility that digital photography gives us. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not a purist by any stretch of the imagination. And so I use certain techniques more than others. Like I fully embrace like exposure blending to increase dynamic range and focus stacking to get sharper images near to far. And that allows you to get really extreme perspectives for landscapes. So I'm not completely allergic to using these techniques. I just find that the folks who rely on these techniques quite a bit, who are starting with photos that are pretty humdrum, maybe not that great to begin with, but then using digital wizardry to make them look amazing. Those images tend to have a certain sameness to them. They tend to look a bit cartoonish, and so, I mean, I don't know. To each their own. I don't begrudge anyone making the choices that they make. It's all art, and whatever you want to do is okay with me, and should be okay with everyone. But I just like you see this a lot in landscape photography. I see a lot of landscape photos out there that look like fantasy images because they are. They're composites of elements that aren't actually in the same place, and swapping in a different sky. Like there's all sorts of crazy things that people do with these images, and they all looked, before AI, they all look like AI generated images. We didn't realize they looked like AI generated images until we started seeing AI generated images. But yeah, they sort of got this fantastical look. They look like something out of a Lord of the Rings movie, which is fine. I think a lot of people really like that, and you see that on Instagram, and you're like, oh wow, that looks amazing. But I just find personally, I find it to be a little cartoonish. And my photography, I'm really trying to capture the magic of the moment. When something really exceptional comes together, but it's more than just that really cool thing that's happening. It's more than like, hey, getting the rainbow, or the moment when the marlin is going through the bait ball or whatever. It's the moment when the shapes spontaneously converge into a pleasing composition. That's the moment I'm looking for. So when it's landscape images, it might be that one perfect cloud that drifts over the landscape and interacts with the shapes in the landscape to create a really compelling visual design. Or when it's wildlife photography, it might be when the animal strikes a pose, creating this dynamic shape. And those magical moments, to me, are what photography is all about. And I find that, you can fake that stuff. You can go and just do whatever you want on the computer, pretty much, if you know what you're doing. But it's just so much more satisfying when you capture it in real life. To me, that's what photography is all about, is about the experience, is being there when you get that amazing sunset sky, or, you're swimming in the middle of 40 marlins as they're rushing for sardines or mackerels, like 2 or 3 feet away from you. Being there in that moment, and then authentically and realistically capturing what you're seeing, there's no greater thrill as far as I'm concerned. That's why I became a photographer. That's what I love about it.
I've always said, and throughout season 1 of the podcast, and anybody that's listened long enough, they've surely heard me say it, but experience first, photo second is something, it's an ethos that I reiterate a lot. And a big part of my work, where I'm emphasizing the experience, I'm emphasizing what it was like to be there, and I'm trying to translate that into my image and into that final piece that I'm sharing with the world. So, in my approach, it's always been very like, keep it real, it's got to be realistic. We don't, like you said, we don't want to make it look all cartoony or super saturated skies or whatever. It needs to be, it's almost a fine line where it has to be real, but beautified, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think I know exactly what you're saying. And it's tricky because sometimes you encounter something or witness something that's really quite surreal. And, like if you get really amazing sunset, the colors can be very unrealistic, the real colors that were there. And so capturing that and presenting it to people in a way that your camera actually saw it. A lot of times people are just going to be like, no, I don't believe this is real. Doesn't matter what you tell me. And so a lot of times I find myself, like desaturating the image to try to take something that was totally bizarre and making it look a little bit more uh, uh, possible to the viewer. But yeah, I mean, like, we're not trying to just capture reality. Like what you said, you want to make it beautiful. We're trying to capture an idealized version of the reality that we're witnessing. We're looking for that decisive moment, that when everything comes together and you get this perfect photograph. And that moment is not going to be the moment that most people see. Like a good example of what I'm talking about is, I knew a photographer who had photos that were selling at the gift store at the Grand Canyon, and like postcards and stuff like that. And he would tell me that the beautiful sunrises and sunset shots, those weren't the ones that would sell. It would be the photos that were taken in the middle of the day. And those, of course, were not very interesting photos, right? They just weren't that idealized beauty that we are striving to capture as photographers. But, he was like, well, yeah, those are the ones that sell because the tourists who come there, that's what they see. And so that's what they think the experience is. They see the beautiful sunrise and sunset, and they don't see that. So they buy the boring images. And so there's always that tension with the photos we're making. We're trying to capture these moments that are really insane, exceptional, that are truly beautiful, that are kind of like an idealized version of the stuff we're witnessing in our everyday life, whether it's nature photography or street photography or whatever you're doing. You're not just trying to go out and capture everything that anyone can see. You're trying to capture the things that people aren't going to see. I think that's kind of core of being an artist, is seeing the things, seeing the possibilities, the creative possibilities that other people don't see. And so that's what we're trying to do. But we're also trying to translate, as you said, translate that experience, making that experience relatable so that they see what you saw. And so there's always this tension between those two opposites. So yeah, I mean, to me, that's the beauty of photography. It's the challenge and the true beauty of it when you get that compromise right, and you capture something that people, like maybe it blows them away, it makes their heads explode, because it's something that's a little mind bending. It's not what they typically experience. And so they look at it and they're like, what's going on here? Wow, that's amazing. But you need to make sure you're doing that in a way that's completely relatable so that they understand or they can figure out what's going on. So, when you find that sweet spot, that's always a great moment.
It is. And it's what I've always categorized my edit style as. I've always called it enhanced realism. And it's just kind of my twist on, this is when I'm looking at a scene, the way I'm feeling or the way that scene is helping me recall a memory or whatever the case might be. I'm taking mental notes. I'm writing it down in my little field notepad, whatever the case might be. And that's what I'm trying to build back to in post-processing. And like you said, I mean, we're all artists at the end of the day. It's artists' interpretation of what choices you make while you're out there. It all begins with going to the places you love, exploring how those places make you feel, and conveying that into an image that allows you to share that experience, that peace, and invite others to enjoy it the way you did.
Yeah. And I mean, I think I would characterize it in a very similar way, though slightly different. As a photographer, it's not really your job to make people see what you see or to experience what you experienced. Your job is not to get them to see the story that you want them to see. Your job is to open their eyes, to invite them to be curious, and maybe to start telling their own story. And so because I think everyone is going to have their own reaction to something. And so, if you try to make them have a specific reaction, like if your goal is to try to make people have that same experience that you had when you made the photo, that's a goal that will certainly fail. There's just no way you can force people to have that experience. But if you trigger a reaction, if you invite their curiosity, if you get them telling their own story about the photo, if they're having their own experience looking at your photo, that's the best you can hope for. So that's really what you're aiming for, is to figure out a way to get them to have an experience looking at your photos. It doesn't have to be the same experience you had making the photo, but it certainly is, your goal is to make them have that experience, to incite that reaction from them. And so to me, that's the tricky part, is, learning how, in essence, to tell a story with your photos. But it's not really telling a story. It's just inviting the viewer to come up with their own story. And so that's why I like to imbue my photos with maybe a sense of mystery, so that they start wondering and they start that storytelling process on their own. So I often work with creative underexposure, or, a lot of times I might just, have large parts of the scene being kind of incoherent or not really. If you're working with underexposure and you've got a lot of the scene in silhouette, it's not really visible to the viewer. And so, working with interesting atmospheric effects, like fog is another way of bringing that sense of mystery into your photos. I'm looking for those ambiguous visual elements to bring into my photos to kind of enhance that sense of mystery. So I think a lot of people think that, photography is about pointing your camera at something and then showing what you saw. And to me, photography is the opposite. It's about pointing your camera at something, but then through the creative use of light and your camera settings, you're trying to change what you see or what the camera sees, so that you're just sort of presenting the viewer with a portion of what you see, or just sort of a truncated view of it. Because I think that's just ultimately more mysterious and more interesting for the viewer. It's not, you're not looking to create a pure documentary record, right?
You said it much, much better than I did in inviting curiosity. That really stood out is, you can't, we're all unique in our own way. We have our own unique backgrounds, experiences that are ours. And me standing before a waterfall, maybe I recall a time with my dad as a kid, or what have you. Somebody else may recall a book that they read or a movie that they watched. But it's that invitation to connect that I really like how you painted that picture there, where it's that invitation to connect in your own way, but you have to plant that spark of curiosity and invite them into your work, and then let it resonate with them in the way they connect with it. I really, really like that.
Well, thank you. It's one of those things where it sounds really great, but when you actually stop and think, well, what does that really mean? And so what I think it means pragmatically is that that's why it's important to learn how to master how light reacts in a photograph, and to learn composition, and how people react to color and things like that. Because these are the things that are going to trigger that reaction. So you're learning basically how to subtly manipulate the emotions of the viewer. And so, how certain visual elements or visual designs might attract the viewer's eye, learning how they might react emotionally to a color or to a certain subject or something like that. That's really what the art of photography is learning how people typically react to these things, and then trying to bring those elements into your photographs. And so that's why I think it's really important, to really think about mastering light and composition, because to me, those two things work together and they pretty much encompass everything else. When we talk about, what does it mean to tell a story? You can tell a story through your creative camera settings, altering the way the light looks in the final photograph, and through a compelling composition. I mean, these things will trigger a visual reaction from the viewer. And so it's not just sort of this esoteric concept. I think there's very practical ways you can go about inviting the viewer to have this storytelling process.
That's very well said. I agree. And it brought me back to when I was first starting to take photography really seriously, I talked to countless people who had been doing this for much longer than I had. And one of the individuals that I spoke with, they told me that the secret to good landscape photography lies entirely in light, composition, and conditions. With those three elements, if you know how to combine them well and you know how to bring it all together in a cohesive, attractive way, you're golden. That's all it takes. Like you mentioned, you're looking for fog, good light, good composition. You're taking into consideration visual layout, because if there's one thing I've learned over the years of doing photography, a mediocre composition can look phenomenal with the right light, but a phenomenal composition can look pretty mediocre with the wrong light or conditions or what have you. It's a very interesting balance, but once you see it and you are conscious of it out there, it's like the doors open and you can flow.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that light and composition are very important, and they kind of are indelibly intertwined. They really work together. And certainly when maybe the light isn't phenomenal, you can pivot and think more strongly about composition, and vice versa. It's even better if you can get amazing light and amazing composition at the same time. And composition is one of those things that's universal. So it doesn't really matter what type of photography you're doing. The techniques of composition, of good visual design, apply to all types of photography. And so once you learn composition, then it really sort of opens your eyes to all the possibilities. One of the things we talk about with landscape photography is conditions, like waiting for the right weather. But what I emphasize to my students is that what's happening with the right conditions, the right weather, is that one, it's having an impact on the way the light works. But two, it's creating compositional opportunities. So when you get the thunderstorm in the sky at sunset, you might get this, amazing light, this really great light in the sky or on the landscape. But the clouds are forming these shapes that can interact with the shapes that are in your landscape. And so it allows you to bring it all together. And so I think that learning light is probably the easier part in a way. Light's something that we see all the time, don't really think about it. But once you start thinking about it, you realize, oh, okay, well, this is good light. This is even better light. This maybe isn't light that works so great for the subject. I think composition is the more difficult of the two to learn and master. And it's something that, I could talk about composition for days, months, years. It can be as simple or as complex as you want it to be. But I think very pragmatically, I'm going to just kind of give you two different styles of shooting where I think about composition. So one would be landscape. With landscape, typically I can slow down and think really critically about my composition. So I find myself I'll be scouting the landscape for interesting foregrounds. Usually what I do is I identify like a point of interest in the background. That's the background scenery. It might be a mountain that I'm photographing. If I'm in the Badlands, it might just be something that's kind of sticking up in the background just to kind of focus the viewer's attention. But once I've identified what the background scenery is going to be, then I start looking for a really compelling foreground. And so I'm looking for leading lines and shapes that will kind of invite the viewer to go from foreground to background. So it just creates this visual progression that invites the viewer into the scene. It's part of that, making that connection we were talking about. And then usually, once I've got that scouted, I go back sunrise or sunset, depending on which is going to work best for that scene, and wait for the right conditions, wait for that perfect sunset sky, something that's going to work well with that chosen composition. And it's often a very thoughtful and deliberate process where I can slow down and really think about it and just perfect everything. Just spend a lot of time figuring out exactly what the perfect composition is and what the perfect light's going to be for that composition. On the flip side, when I'm underwater photographing a bunch of marlins and sea lions attacking a bait ball, the action is fast and furious. And I'm in this environment where I'm not really in full control of where I am positioned relative to my subject. They're moving, I'm floating around in the water, bobbing up and down because it's not really an environment that human beings naturally are capable of being in. And I can't think about anything that's going on. I'm just, my camera's out in front of me. I'm not even looking through the viewfinder. I am just watching this happen and shooting, spraying and praying. And the best I can do is when I'm done shooting that, I can go back, I can review my photos, see what works, see what doesn't work. I might have an idea in my head what it is that I want to have happen. And that idea gets further refined after every shooting session where I can review my work and see, as I said, what's working and what's not working. And then I go back the next day and I'm waiting for convergence of events to come together that's going to create that pleasing composition. So, one shooting style is very deliberate, very thoughtful. The other is chaotic and completely random. But my end goal for both is the exact same. I want to have these really pleasing visual designs that have these dynamic shapes that are working together. And so that's what you're always looking for. So you can't really do that unless you learn composition, you learn how to master composition. So that's why I think it's so important, because even when you're spraying and praying, you still at the back of your mind have got an idea, what it is you want to be happening. And so you can kind of see that happening in front of you. And that that's the moment, that's the decisive moment to be triggering the shutter or firing like crazy, as the case may be. And so, to be able to recognize the potential at that moment on the fly when things are happening crazy, it's really, really critical to have practiced that skill a lot in conditions where you can be more thoughtful and deliberate. So all of that landscape photography I've done over the years, where I really had to learn composition as a critical component of it, now that becomes instinct for when I'm doing a spray and pray wildlife shoot under the water.
That makes sense. You're translating all of this experience and all of these different approaches into your goal of the best possible outcome when everything is going wild right in front of you. And, like you mentioned, you can go slower in the landscapes setting. And, what you explained there, where you find the background and then you find the intriguing foreground or the shapes or what have you, you're looking for lines, patterns, textures, forms, features, whatever necessary to give that foreground interest, but not to detract from your background or your subject or what have you. That was the switch that flipped for me. And I noticed that my composition started improving almost immediately once I could break it down into 3 different pieces. So you've got your background, your midground, your foreground. And once you've identified, okay, this is what I want to emphasize in my scene, where, what's the background doing and how am I going to connect all of these pieces through the composition? It feels like you kind of level up in a way, because when you first start in photography, it's daunting. You're like, you walk into a busy forest scene, or you walk up and you see this waterfall with all these beautiful rocks and all of these things moving, and there's so much happening. But once you can break it down into that visual language, at least for me, I feel like it becomes so much simpler.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not the kind of thing that you can easily figure out on your own, because, as you said, it requires this visual language. And when I talk about composition, I emphasize I don't have any formal training in art. And so a lot of the compositional techniques I describe, I might call them something. It's just my name for it. Someone who's been to art school might be like, oh, no, you're wrong. That's not called that. This is actually something else. Doesn't matter. Whether you've got the right words to describe it or not, as long as you can describe it, I think that's the important thing, as long as you build that visual language. But, these aren't intuitive concepts, these visual design techniques, you really kind of need someone to talk about, someone who knows what they're talking about. They need to tell you about these things, at least get you started thinking about them. And once that happens, as you said, it's an eye-opening moment. This happened for me with a photographer mentor probably 25 years ago before I became a full-time pro, sat me down and asked me, well, he's looking at my photos. He's like, well, why do you like this photo? And I'm rather stupidly answering, it's a pretty sunset, and he's like, no, 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 no. The reason why you like this photo, the reason why this photo works, and he starts talking about the shapes and the leading visual elements. And I'd never heard anyone talk this way. And it blew my mind, right? And so you kind of need that. You kind of need someone who's got that visual language who gets you starting to think about it. And then when you start thinking about it, you start seeing it everywhere. And so suddenly the world begins, photographically begins to make more sense. When you go to that waterfall scene, you're not overwhelmed by the visual chaos of everything in front of you. You're like, okay, well, I've got the waterfall. That's going to be my background. Now I just need to find some rapids to put in my foreground, and that's going to make a more interesting composition. You know what it is that you're looking for. And so the more you practice that, the more you study it, the more you think about it, the more you engage in the process of creating this visual language for yourself or using someone else's visual language, either way is fine. The more you're going to start seeing these moments occur where these random visual elements that are floating around spontaneously align to create something photogenic, to create something compelling. This is what famous street photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson called the decisive moment. And that's what he was talking about. He's like, this isn't the moment when the lion lunges at the wildebeest. That's not the moment he's talking about. He's talking about the moment when these random compositional shapes come together in a pleasing way. And so the only way you're going to ever learn when this decisive moment occurs is if you practice it, if you study it, if you think about it, and try very hard to incorporate the lessons you have learned into your photographs.
Very similar interactions with mentors and portfolio reviews. And as you were explaining that, very similar, I had a very similar experience where I had a photographer ask me, what do you think about the light in one of my images? And I was like, it's light. And he's like, no. The way you're going to improve is you need to learn and understand how to describe these things. You need to learn and understand what all of these different elements are doing and how they're working together. And once you can, he referred to it as a visual vocabulary, but once you expand your visual vocabulary and you can actually describe the light, the brightness, the color, the contrast, you can describe the composition. Are we doing triangles, rule of thirds, the Fibonacci sequence, whatever you've got going on? You need to be able to describe it, because once you've programmed in your brain, this is what this is, your brain automatically starts recognizing it. You notice it. It becomes second nature to start seeing these things because you can define it visually and verbally, and you can translate that into your work. And yeah, sure, there's times even today where I'll go out and despite knowing these things, I still struggle to get an image some days. And that's normal. But having that understanding, I feel like it takes you out of the I'm just out here taking pictures and taking pictures of things that I like to I'm really forming that visual story that you touched on earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the first lesson for anyone who's interested in becoming a photographer, is that photography is not about finding something interesting or beautiful and pointing your camera at it, triggering the shutter. Photography is more about what's going on inside. It's more about it's finding those subjects or moments that are photogenic. It's you're creating art. That's what you're trying to do. And if all you're doing is pointing your camera at something that's interesting or cool, you're just going to end up with a documentary record of something that's interesting and cool. But if you want to make a great photo, you need to think more deeply about what you're photographing. And you can make great photos of things that aren't exceptionally beautiful. Something being photogenic and something being beautiful are two different things. They can overlap, but they don't always overlap. And, like I mentioned, Cartier-Bresson earlier, his work, he didn't walk around looking for the most gorgeous Parisian supermodels to photograph. He just photographed everyday people and things. But he was seeing those photogenic moments that were arising from the random chaos of everyday city life. And that's what great street photography is finding those convergences of shadow and light and composition. And it's the same with any other type of photography. If you want to be a landscape photographer, if you think that landscape photography is about going and finding the most beautiful epic mountain and pointing your camera at it, you're going to be really disappointed. If you think wildlife photography is about going and going on an African safari and waiting to see a lion and pointing your camera at it, you're going to be very disappointed. You're going to end up with a lot of really boring photos of something that's majestic and beautiful. Your job is to find a way to take the beauty and the majesty of your subject and to really reveal it to the viewer and to transform it into something artistic. And you quickly realize that if you can do that with something everyday and mundane, then when you're shooting something that's incredibly beautiful, you can produce something even more spectacular. But, I would often talk about how, a good photographer would photograph something like a rat and find a way to make really interesting rat photos, and a really great photographer would produce photos of rats that were better than just everyday photos of tigers. And someone responded to me and said, "Oh yeah, show me one good photo of a rat." And it was a bit of a challenge for me because I've never photographed a rat. So, but then a few years back, I saw some photographer doing a sequence of photos of rats in the city that they lived in, and they were beautiful. And I really wish I had kept the contact information for this one person who challenged me. I was going to say, "Aha, here's your beautiful rats." But I think the lesson there is that you don't have to go to exotic locations to make beautiful photos. You don't have to go and photograph amazing things. You just have to keep an eye out for the random things that happen that are going to make those beautiful photogenic moments. And that's to me what photography is all about, is seeing the beautiful in the mundane, seeing the opportunities in the everyday. If you can do that, then when you do go to those more exotic locations, you'll be better prepared to come away with meaningful images. I think every photographer, whether they travel or not, they should find photo subjects close to home and really embrace what the local area has to offer. Some of the most meaningful photos that I've taken have been within a half-day drive from my house, places like the Badlands or Lake Superior, or even just, a few minutes away from live here in the outskirts of Minneapolis. I mean, just this past summer, there were a bunch of white pelicans that were congregating in the lakes and the rivers all over southern Minnesota. And so I found a spot that was about a 35-minute drive away from my house. And I went out there every morning to photograph the white pelicans. And I got some photos I'm really happy with. I used to call it, finding the exotic close to home, or shooting the stuff close to home as if it were an exotic location. That's the mentality I bring to it, is, even if you're shooting a local landscape that's not that dramatic, treat it like it is dramatic, like try to find those epic circumstances that make it look as every bit as dramatic as going to photograph Iceland or Mount Fitzroy in Patagonia. So I think that's the challenge, is just to find out what the possibilities are close to home, embrace them, and see what you can come up with.
I love that. I absolutely love that. It's finding the beauty in your own backyard and realizing that the light anywhere around you, the light is the same. You're still going to get that beautiful soft light at sunrise, sunset. You're still going to have opportunities. You have different subjects. Of course, here in the Great Lakes region, for instance, we don't have the Himalayas. We don't have the Rockies. But what we do have is unique to this region. It's its own beauty. It's its own invitation to explore and be curious. And I've always adhered to the same mindset of just get out there, explore, look around you. There's Maybe there's some really nice reeds or trees or something right outside the grocery store. I've done it where I have pulled right into a parking lot, walked right across the street to a retention pond at a neighborhood and shot small scenes or isolated a subject against a background. Sure, maybe it looks like I was in the middle of some remote forest. No, I was in the middle of suburbia just shooting a retention pond, but it's out there. You've just got to go find it. And to your point, the better you get in your own backyard, when you do go somewhere that's extremely photogenic, prone to incredible conditions or what have you, you're going to be way better prepared. And you're not going to be coming away with just call them snapshots. You're going to be coming away with actual artistic pieces that represent something beyond I was here.
Yeah. I mean, everyone's got to learn how to find photos. And, photography is not going on Instagram, seeing photos someone else has taken, and then going to that same place and taking the same photo. Photography is about finding your own unique creative vision, your own compositions. And the best place to do that is your local area, wherever you are. Because for most of you, you're like living someplace that's incredibly epic. Most of us are not. For most of us, what's in your local area isn't really being photographed by anyone else. And so that's a perfect proving ground for you to really sharpen your skills and to hone your creative vision. And so it's really all about finding those places and those moments where everything comes together and you get something really interesting, really unique, something that resonates with people. It's when you find that world-class shooting spot within 20 minutes of your house that no one else has ever noticed before. That's an amazing feeling. And that's what will prepare you for taking amazing photos anywhere you go in the world.
Yeah. Before we close it out and wrap it up here, if you could give listeners any advice from your adventure as a photographer, your trip to Baja California, your trip to anywhere in the world, of all the landscapes, all the places you've been, if you could give listeners one piece of advice, what would it be?
No matter where you go, no matter what you photograph, embrace what is offered to you. A lot of times when I go to exotic destinations, conditions don't align with my expectations. I don't get what I was hoping to get when I was there. And so the best thing you can do is to embrace what is offered and to just immerse yourself in the experience. And so even if it's something that I don't like doing, if I go to a spot and I'm just not getting what I want, I figure out, well, what is here? What can I photograph? Even if it's not something that is typically what I enjoy doing, I embrace it anyways and make the best of it. And so whether you're traveling or whether you're working close to home, trying to find the interesting things to photograph, even if you want to be a landscape photographer and your local area doesn't have that, well, try street photography. Just practice, just get out and embrace what is offered and do the best you can. And you'll find that those skills that you hone doing that will translate to other things that you're doing. But you'll also find that when you do go to other destinations, when you travel a bit, that you're going to come away with much better photos. You're going to be much happier. You're not going to have a trip that's ruined by too much rain or whatever. You're going to be able to make good photos no matter where you go or what the conditions are like. So embrace and take advantage of what is offered.
Excellent advice. Well, thank you very much, Ian, for jumping on. It's been an outstanding discussion. Excellent advice for all of the listeners out there. For those that want to check out your work, want to get involved in your workshops and explore some of your educational materials, where can they find you?
Well, folks can check out my personal website, ianplant.com, where you can take a look at my photo portfolio. And that's got links to everything else that I've got going on. I've also got a photo education platform that I call PhotoMasters. So you can visit photomasters.com. And what I do there is I provide a bit of a mentor experience. So I'm definitely doing a lot of photo workshops and tours, but I'm also constantly putting out educational ebooks and videos. And so PhotoMasters has got a lot of free and premium resources to help photographers become the best they can be. I do lots of interviews with other photographers, lots of useful information there. And there's a lot of opportunities to interact with me directly through my many webinars and other services that I offer through PhotoMasters. And so basically the goal there is to provide as much of that photo mentor experience that was so critical to me when I was developing as a photographer.
I'll put all of the links that Ian mentioned into the show notes below so that you guys can go and check him out, see some of his work, and get involved in some of what Ian's doing out there. But Ian, I just want to say thank you so much for jumping on an episode and having this discussion, man. It's been just excellent.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm hoping we can connect again.
Another huge thank you to Ian for joining us. If you guys haven't yet, make sure to check out his links in the show notes below. His writing, his teaching, and the way he breaks down decision-making in the field have helped a ton of photographers, myself included, see the landscape differently. And I know it'll do the same for you. In the next episode, we're going to be taking a trip to Minnesota's North Shore with the first trip recap of Season 2. The wins, the struggles, and everything that happened in between. Make sure you are following along on your favorite podcast platform so that you can be notified as soon as the next episode becomes available. If you'd like to support the show in Season 2, you can do so through the links in the show notes. Every little bit helps keep the podcast going, and I appreciate each and every one of you. As always, I'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Take care, everybody.